Before the story of miracles, before the plagues, before the sea parted and the mountain trembled, there was a call, a whisper that stirred through eternity, searching for hearts ready to listen. It was not a command shouted from heaven, but a gentle summons that carried the weight of divine intention. This call sought not the strong nor the perfect, but the willing. It was the beginning of a journey that would unite two brothers under one purpose, shaping history through obedience, faith, and courage. The call was not for one man alone, but for two voices, one that would speak and one that would act, woven together by the hand of God to deliver a nation from bondage. In the land of Egypt, a people cried beneath the weight of chains. Their prayers rose like smoke into the unseen, their voices trembling with longing for freedom. They believed they had been forgotten, that their pain had become lost in the noise of empire. But heaven had been listening all along. Each cry, each tear, each breath of hope became a seed of deliverance, waiting for its appointed hour. Among them, destiny was already unfolding in the lives of two brothers, Moses and Aaron, who would one day stand together against the power of Pharaoh and speak words that would change the world. Moses' journey began in paradox. Born into oppression but raised in privilege, he grew among the rulers of the very nation that enslaved his people. He learned the wisdom of Egypt, its language, its laws, its power. But deep within, a quiet unrest lived in his spirit. No palace could silence the truth written into his soul. He was a man caught between two worlds, the luxury of the court and the suffering of his own blood. In that tension, God was shaping a leader, one who would learn compassion through conflict and humility through exile. Aaron's path was different, but no less divine. He lived among the oppressed, feeling the sting of injustice and the ache of unanswered prayers. His strength was forged in endurance, his faith refined through years of silence. While Moses walked the polished halls of Pharaoh's palace, Aaron walked the dusty roads of captivity, his heart holding the pulse of his people's pain. Their separation was not an accident, it was preparation. For when the time came, both would bring something essential to the mission: Moses, the vision; Aaron, the voice. When God finally spoke through the burning bush, Moses trembled at the sound of his calling. He doubted his ability, questioned his worth, and feared his inadequacies. But God's plan was never meant to rest on one man's strength. Aaron would be his spokesman, the living answer to Moses' hesitation. Together, they would carry out a mission that neither could fulfill alone. Two brothers, two hearts, one divine purpose. The call that began in the wilderness would soon thunder across nations. Before their story unfolds in full, remember this: divine purpose often begins in silence, in ordinary lives shaped by unseen preparation. The same God who called Moses and Aaron still calls today, through the quiet moments when faith feels small but destiny waits to awaken. If you enjoy stories like this, messages that reveal deeper meaning behind faith and courage, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Your support helps this message reach others who need hope and inspiration. Before their paths crossed in purpose, two brothers lived under the same promise, but through vastly different realities. One was surrounded by gold and marble, his childhood echoing with the laughter of royalty, the fragrance of luxury, and the language of power. The other breathed the dust of labor and the sighs of weary hearts, his every sunrise filled with the sound of chains and the cries of the oppressed. Their blood was the same, but their worlds could not have been further apart. While Moses was molded by the discipline of Egyptian education and the silence of privilege, Aaron was refined by endurance, faith, and the ache of waiting for deliverance that seemed forever delayed. Within Pharaoh's palace, Moses grew into a man of quiet observation. His eyes witnessed both the majesty of empire and the cruelty that sustained it. Every monument he saw was built on the broken backs of his own people, though he did not fully grasp that truth until much later. His hands learned to hold the scepter of command, but his heart longed for something beyond the walls of power. Deep inside, a restless stirring grew, an unspoken awareness that he did not belong to the gods of Egypt, nor to the throne that shaped his youth. His heart was drawn toward a people he barely knew, a longing that would one day ignite into purpose. Far from those golden halls, Aaron's life unfolded among the suffering multitude. He was the voice of faith that refused to die even when the lash of oppression grew heavy. Each day taught him how to endure, how to keep hope alive when freedom felt impossible. His strength was not learned through privilege, but through persistence. Every prayer he whispered became an offering of trust to a God who seemed silent, but whose silence was never absence. Aaron's years of hardship shaped him into a man of compassion and courage, ready to stand for truth even when it cost him everything. Time passed, and the distance between them widened. Moses became a man of exile after one impulsive act of justice led to fear and flight. He left Egypt behind, trading the luxury of the palace for the solitude of the wilderness. His heart carried both guilt and confusion, haunted by questions of identity and purpose. The desert became his teacher, stripping away the illusions of power and teaching him the language of stillness. Through the long, quiet years, his pride gave way to humility, and his fear began to transform into wisdom. Aaron remained in the heart of suffering, watching generation after generation labor under tyranny. Hope had become a fragile flame, flickering but not extinguished. Even as he aged, his faith remained steady, his conviction unbroken. He became a man others looked to for guidance when despair crept into their souls. His faith was not loud, but enduring, a steady rhythm of trust that prepared him for the moment when God's plan would finally unfold. Destiny was moving unseen, weaving together two separate lives into one divine purpose. The brother shaped by silence and solitude would need the one who had learned to speak with boldness. The man who had walked among kings would need the one who had walked among slaves. God was preparing a balance of power and compassion, strength and gentleness, authority and humility. Their reunion would not simply be a meeting of family, but a merging of callings, each completing what the other lacked. When the day finally came for their paths to meet, heaven had already written the moment long before it occurred. Moses, hesitant and burdened by doubt, would soon hear a familiar name spoken by the fire that burned without consuming. And in another place, Aaron would feel a stirring within his spirit, a pull stronger than memory, calling him toward his brother. Their destinies, once separated by circumstance, were about to converge. Through them, God would speak and act, revealing to the world that deliverance was not born through a single man, but through unity in obedience. Their story reminds every heart that purpose is never random. The years that seem wasted often become preparation. The pain that feels meaningless can forge endurance. Every contrast in their lives was part of a divine pattern. Moses needed Aaron's voice, and Aaron needed Moses' courage. Two brothers, two lives, one destiny, bound by a call that would shake the foundations of an empire. Amid the barren stillness of Midian, where the winds whispered through endless dunes, Moses encountered the fire that refused to die. It was a moment beyond reason, a flame that burned with brilliance, yet left no ash, no smoke, no destruction. Drawn closer, he felt both wonder and terror. Out of that light came a voice that spoke not to his ears but to his soul, declaring a mission greater than any he could imagine. He was to return to the land he had fled, to confront the power he once feared, and to speak words that would shake the heart of Pharaoh himself. Fear rose within him like a flood. The voice that once carried the strength of a prince now trembled with uncertainty. He saw his weaknesses clearer than his worth. Every excuse poured from his lips, his lack of eloquence, his broken past, his hidden fears. He believed himself unfit for divine service, but the one who called him saw beyond his hesitations. In that sacred encounter, heaven revealed a truth that would define all divine missions. Human weakness never disqualifies what divine will ordains. Even as Moses hesitated, provision had already been made. The call was never meant to rest on one voice alone. Aaron, still in Egypt, was being prepared as the companion and spokesman who would give sound to what Moses could not express. When Moses doubted his ability to speak, God answered not with rebuke, but with partnership. Aaron would become his mouth, his voice to the people, his echo in the court of Pharaoh. Through them both, heaven's message would be spoken and fulfilled. When the two brothers met again, after so many years, their reunion carried both tenderness and awe. Time had carved wisdom into their faces, and experience had humbled their spirits. Moses, carrying the memory of the burning bush, shared the impossible mission set before him. Aaron listened, his heart stirred by the courage and mystery in his brother's eyes. Instead of questioning, he embraced the call with faith. The voice that had endured Egypt's oppression would now speak against it with divine authority. The strength of Aaron's faith gave shape to Moses' resolve. One spoke with the passion of conviction, the other acted with the certainty of revelation. They became two vessels carrying one message: liberation not only from physical chains, but from the bondage of fear and disbelief. Their partnership displayed the beauty of divine balance, where humility meets confidence and silence finds speech. Moses, the reluctant prophet, became the vessel of divine power. Aaron, the voice of confidence, became the channel of divine expression. Neither was greater, neither lesser. Their unity revealed a truth that transcends time. Divine missions thrive not on individual greatness, but on cooperation rooted in trust and faith. Each completed the other in purpose, each depended on the other's strength. When they stood together, heaven's plan gained form in the world of men. Moses carried the authority of the call, and Aaron gave its sound. Pharaoh would soon hear their words, but what he would truly confront was not two men. It was the union of divine will expressed through human obedience. That unity would challenge the might of an empire and expose the fragility of earthly power before the eternal strength of faith. Through their partnership, the world was reminded that God's work is never hindered by human frailty. When one doubts, another believes. When one hesitates, another speaks. The call that began in fire found its echo in flesh and blood, proving that heaven often works through the harmony of willing hearts rather than the perfection of a single soul. Before Pharaoh's throne, two brothers stood side by side. The hall gleamed with marble and gold, the air heavy with incense and authority. Before them sat the ruler of the most powerful nation on earth, draped in symbols of divine kingship, convinced that his word was law and his power eternal. Yet in that moment, two men armed with nothing but faith and obedience carried a message that would soon shatter the illusion of his divinity. One held a staff that had once guided sheep through the wilderness. The other carried a voice that carried heaven's command. Together, they embodied the strength of unity forged by divine purpose. When Moses lifted his hand and Aaron spoke, their differences no longer mattered. What one lacked, the other provided. The staff of Moses became the instrument of miracles, while the speech of Aaron became the channel through which divine authority was declared. Pharaoh heard the words as coming from men, but behind those words moved the unseen power of the eternal. Every act, every command, every miracle carried the weight of partnership between faith and obedience. Their unity became a mirror of divine order. Moses represented vision, the quiet strength that listens before it acts. Aaron represented communication, the courage that speaks truth before power. Their cooperation revealed that divine missions demand not rivalry, but harmony, not pride, but surrender. The empire of Egypt was built on hierarchy, But God's kingdom moves through unity. Their strength was not found in dominance, but in trust. Each encounter with Pharaoh tested not only their courage, but their bond. When disbelief hardened the king's heart, Moses looked toward heaven, while Aaron continued to speak without fear. When miracles unfolded before the eyes of the empire, they stood firm, knowing that their mission was not to impress, but to obey. Their faith was not measured by results, but by persistence. Together they learned that true partnership means standing side by side, even when success seems far away. Every act they performed carried a spiritual echo. When Moses stretched out his staff, Aaron's voice proclaimed its meaning. The rod that turned into a serpent, the waters that turned into blood, the dust that became gnats. All were visible signs of an invisible truth. God's purpose moves through cooperation, not competition. Neither brother could have fulfilled the mission alone. Their unity was the vessel through which divine power flowed. Among their people, this unity became a symbol of hope. Those who had long suffered under Pharaoh's tyranny began to see in them the image of divine partnership, a reminder that liberation comes when faith and action walk hand in hand. Through their example, a nation learned that obedience requires community, that strength grows when hearts align toward one calling. Pharaoh's court, built upon pride, could not comprehend the strength of brotherhood. He saw two men, but heaven saw one voice spoken through two lives. Each plague, each command, each confrontation stripped away the illusions of earthly authority and revealed the unyielding truth that unity rooted in faith can move mountains and part seas. The power of partnership between Moses and Aaron continues to speak across ages. It shows that divine missions flourish when gifts are shared, when strength uplifts weakness, and when courage flows between hearts that trust one another. Their bond became the living proof that the mightiest victories are not won through domination, but through cooperation shaped by love and faith. Before the throne of Egypt, faith stood face to face with empire. The marble halls that had witnessed countless decrees of power now trembled beneath the weight of words spoken not by kings, but by servants of divine command. Moses and Aaron entered Pharaoh's court not with weapons or armies, but with the authority of heaven. Their mission was not to overthrow a ruler, but to reveal a truth that no crown could silence, that the power of God surpasses the might of empires, and that freedom is not granted by men, but declared by divine will. Pharaoh's gaze met theirs with disdain. His heart, hardened by pride, refused to bow before any authority beyond his own. He saw two aging men speaking of a God unseen, a God unknown to the idols of Egypt. To him, their words were an insult to the gods he claimed to embody, a threat to the system that kept his throne secure. He dismissed them with arrogance, refusing to acknowledge the command to release a people who had built his cities and sustained his empire. But behind Pharaoh's defiance was a greater conflict. The struggle between divine purpose and human pride, between eternal truth and temporal power. When Aaron cast down his staff and it became a serpent, the magicians of Egypt imitated the act through deceit. For a moment, Pharaoh smirked, convinced that divine signs could be counterfeited. But when Aaron's serpent swallowed theirs, the message was unmistakable. Deception could mimic power, but never conquer truth. The court fell silent, though Pharaoh's heart refused to yield. That silence marked the beginning of a battle, not of flesh and blood, but of wills. Heaven against the empire, faith against fear. Each plague that followed carried both judgment and mercy. The waters of the Nile turned crimson, the air filled with swarms, the earth trembled beneath the weight of locusts and darkness. Egypt's gods fell silent, unable to defend the land that worshipped them. Every act of power stripped away another layer of Pharaoh's illusion. What began as defiance turned into desperation, though he still resisted surrender. Through each command, Moses spoke firmly, Aaron's voice steady beside him. Together, They stood unmoved, not by their strength, but by the certainty of divine backing. The plagues were not mere punishments, but revelations. Each one exposed the emptiness of Egypt's idols and the futility of human pride. What Pharaoh called sovereignty was shown to be fragility before the living God. His refusal to release Israel was not simply a political act, it was rebellion against the Creator himself. And through it all, Moses and Aaron carried the weight of their mission with unshaken conviction. They were not warriors, but messengers, instruments of a power that transcended all mortal rule. Even as Egypt's land suffered, a quiet line was drawn between oppression and deliverance. Where Pharaoh's heart hardened, the hearts of the Israelites began to awaken. Hope, long buried under the dust of despair, stirred once more. The voice of Aaron proclaimed God's justice, while the hand of Moses revealed his might. Together, they demonstrated that true strength lies not in domination, but in obedience to the one who commands creation itself. Faith confronted empire not through violence, but through steadfast endurance. Each encounter between Moses and Pharaoh deepened the revelation that freedom is not granted by those who rule, but by the one who reigns above all. When darkness covered Egypt, it was not merely the absence of light, but the symbol of blindness that comes from pride. And while Egypt's palaces were filled with shadows, the dwellings of Israel were illuminated with divine presence. Through the confrontation, the world witnessed the clash between arrogance and surrender. Pharaoh's refusal to bow became a lesson for generations to come, a reminder that power built on pride always crumbles before truth. The mission of Moses and Aaron was not just to liberate a nation, but to reveal the supremacy of God's purpose over every empire that claims eternal dominion. Their faith did not bow, their voices did not falter, and their obedience turned the course of history toward freedom. Before the dawn broke over the sea, an entire nation stood between captivity and freedom. Behind them, the chariots of Egypt thundered with rage. Before them, the waters stretched wide and deep, an impassable barrier reflecting their fear. The people cried out, their voices filled with panic, their hearts trembling as the sound of pursuit grew louder. Moses, holding the staff that had witnessed divine wonders, stood before them with eyes fixed not on the storm, but on the unseen hand guiding it. Aaron stood beside him, steady and unshaken, reminding the people that deliverance was not a dream. It was already written in the heart of God. When the wind began to rise, it carried with it the breath of divine promise. The sea trembled, the waves shifted, and the impossible began to unfold before their eyes. Waters divided, walls of liquid glass towering on either side, and the path of deliverance stretched forward across the seabed. It was not the strength of men that made the way, but the power of trust that moved mountains and parted oceans. Each step the Israelites took upon the dry ground was a step of faith, a walk between fear and freedom, between death and life. Behind them, Pharaoh's army pursued, blind to the warning written in the miracle before them. Chariots rolled into the path meant for deliverance, driven by pride that refused to yield even before the evidence of divine power. But when the final Israelite crossed to safety, the waters closed with thunderous force, swallowing the symbols of oppression in their depths. The sea that once stood as a wall of division became a grave for tyranny. Faith had triumphed over fear, and trust had silenced the voice of empire. For the first time in generations, the people of Israel breathed as a free nation. Their chains were gone, their enemies defeated, and their eyes lifted toward the horizon of promise. In that moment of awe, the song of Moses rose above the waves, joined by the voices of thousands who had witnessed the impossible. Their praise was not merely gratitude, it was the recognition that deliverance belongs not to human effort, but to divine mercy. Aaron's heart swelled as he watched the people sing. His journey from the shadows of slavery to the shore of freedom mirrored the transformation of an entire nation. Every act of obedience, every word spoken in faith, had led to this moment of triumph. Standing beside his brother, he saw not only victory, but the beginning of a new responsibility. Freedom was not an ending, but a calling, a summons to walk in trust beyond the sea and into the unknown. Moses, who once doubted his worth, now stood as the vessel through which God's power had flowed. The staff he held was no longer a mere object, it was a symbol of faith made visible. Every miracle it performed was a reminder that obedience unlocks divine movement. As he gazed across the sea, he understood that deliverance was never meant to glorify men, but to reveal the unwavering faithfulness of the one who leads through impossible paths. The Red Sea became more than a geographical crossing. It became a timeless symbol of transformation. Every believer who faces the deep, every soul cornered by fear and circumstance, finds in this story the assurance that faith can make a way where no path exists. The miracle was not just in the parted waters, but in the hearts that dared to step forward when the way seemed lost. Long after the sea returned to its calm, the lesson endured. Trust is stronger than terror, and faith walks where sight cannot. Moses and Aaron's unity had opened the way for millions to find freedom, proving once again that divine purpose moves most powerfully through those who dare to believe in the unseen. Freedom brought its own burdens. The wilderness, vast and unyielding, stretched before the people like an uncharted test of faith. The songs of victory soon faded into murmurs of complaint, and gratitude turned to impatience. Moses, once celebrated as the deliverer, now stood at the center of endless disputes. Every thirst, every hunger, every discomfort became a challenge to his authority. Aaron, standing beside him, carried the tension between compassion for the people and loyalty to the divine command. Together, they bore the invisible weight of leadership, a responsibility that tested both their strength and their unity. The desert revealed what slavery had hidden, the human heart's restlessness when comfort is lost. People who had witnessed the sea divide now doubted the one who had saved them. They longed for the food of Egypt, forgetting the chains that had bound them. Moses cried out to heaven, not in anger, but in exhaustion, asking why the burden of so many restless souls had been placed upon him. Leadership was no longer a triumph, but a trial of endurance. Every complaint pierced his heart like an arrow, and every rebellion forced him to seek strength beyond himself. Aaron, the priest and spokesman, became the bridge between divine holiness and human frailty. He comforted those who doubted, reminded them of God's faithfulness, and interceded when their fear turned to rebellion. His role was not only to speak on behalf of his brother, but to carry the spiritual pulse of a nation still learning to trust. Through him, the people heard not just the commands of heaven, but the compassion of a God who understood their weakness. As days turned into years, the weight of leadership deepened. Moses faced loneliness few could comprehend. His conversations with God became the only refuge where he could pour out his weariness without judgment. Aaron, though surrounded by the people, felt the pressure of expectation pressing upon his shoulders. Both men learned that guiding others through freedom is harder than leading them out of bondage. Deliverance requires a moment of faith. Leadership demands a lifetime of perseverance. Every miracle they witnessed came with a cost. When manna fell from heaven, gratitude lasted only for a moment before discontent returned. When water flowed from the rock, the people rejoiced, then doubted again. Moses struck the stone in frustration, revealing how deeply the strain had reached his spirit. Leadership had turned from a calling into a crucible. It burned away pride, comfort, and self-reliance, leaving behind only raw dependence on divine strength. Aaron carried his own burdens. As high priest, he bore the sins of the nation in sacred rituals that symbolized reconciliation. Every sacrifice reminded him of the frailty of the people and the mercy that sustained them. His role demanded purity and patience, for he stood between judgment and grace. Through his hands, the nation found forgiveness. Through his prayers, they found hope. But even his position did not shield him from criticism or misunderstanding. The people's trust wavered as easily as their faith. Moses and Aaron stood together through storms of rebellion and waves of despair. When others faltered, they held the line between chaos and order, reminding Israel that freedom without faith becomes another form of bondage. Their leadership was not a crown of glory, but a mantle of sacrifice. They carried the pain of those they led and the disappointment of seeing hearts resist the truth they proclaimed. Still, they did not abandon their mission. Leadership in the wilderness became the refining fire that shaped them both. It taught them that divine calling is not about comfort but about faithfulness. Every trial drew them deeper into reliance on the one who had chosen them. Their journey through the wilderness was not just about reaching a destination, but about becoming the kind of leaders who could bear the presence of God among imperfect people. Under the vast wilderness sky, where the echoes of Sinai's thunder had barely faded, a restless impatience began to stir among the people. Moses had ascended the mountain to commune with the divine presence, and as the days stretched into weeks, uncertainty took root. Without the familiar sound of their leader's voice, fear began to whisper through the camp. The same hearts that had witnessed the sea divide and the heavens speak now trembled under the weight of silence. Faith, which once burned bright in moments of deliverance, began to waver under the pressure of waiting. Crowds gathered around Aaron, their faces marked by frustration and anxiety. They pleaded not for the return of God's voice, but for a substitute, something visible, tangible, controllable. Their desire was not born of rebellion alone, but of insecurity, a longing for reassurance that felt absent in Moses' delay. They sought comfort in the illusion of certainty, mistaking form for faith. Aaron stood at a crossroads between conviction and compassion, torn between his duty to truth and his fear of losing the people he was meant to lead. Pressure mounted with every passing hour. The cries of the multitude grew louder, the demands more desperate. In a moment of weakness, Aaron chose appeasement over confrontation. He instructed them to bring their gold, the very ornaments given to them through divine favor. The people rushed to obey, melting their treasures into an image that reflected their confusion, a calf of shining metal, lifeless yet captivating. What was meant to represent strength became a symbol of their surrender to fear. When the idol stood complete, music filled the camp. Dances erupted, voices shouted in celebration, and the air vibrated with false joy. The people proclaimed that this golden image had brought them out of Egypt, rewriting history with their own hands. It was a scene of tragic irony. Those who had once trembled at the voice of God now bowed before the work of their own making. Aaron watched in silence, his heart heavy with the weight of compromise. His decision to calm their unrest had unleashed chaos instead. High upon the mountain, Moses received the revelation of the law written by divine hand. The covenant between heaven and earth was sealed in words of sacred fire. But as he descended, the sound of shouting reached his ears, not cries of worship but of disorder. When his eyes beheld the idol and the revelry surrounding it, anger burned within him, not from pride, but from grief. The covenant had been broken before it was even delivered. With trembling hands, he cast down the tablets, shattering them upon the ground, a symbol of hearts that had already fractured in faith. Aaron's confrontation with Moses was not that of defiance, but of shame. Words faltered as he tried to explain his actions, shifting blame toward the people's demands and his own fear of losing control. But beneath his excuses lay the ache of regret. He had stood as the mouthpiece of God before kings, but before his own people, his voice had faltered. Leadership had turned into compromise, and silence had allowed idolatry to flourish. His failure was not born of rebellion but of fear, the same fear that often leads hearts astray when faith demands endurance. Judgment followed swiftly, not as cruelty, but as purification. Those who refused repentance faced the consequence of their choices. The camp that had once echoed with laughter now trembled with sorrow. Through the ashes of failure, a new awareness began to rise. The people saw the cost of turning from truth, and Aaron learned that leadership requires courage to stand firm, even when the crowd demands what feels easier. His repentance was not spoken through words, but through the quiet endurance of guilt and grace. The golden calf stood as a warning through generations, a reminder that idolatry is not only about statues of metal, but about hearts that seek substitutes for faith. Aaron's silence became his greatest teacher, revealing that obedience without conviction is emptiness. From that silence, he would learn to speak again, not from fear, but from humility. And through that humility, God would restore what human weakness had broken, proving that even failure can become a vessel of redemption. After the storm of rebellion, an aching stillness settled over the camp. Smoke from the shattered idol drifted into the air, a haunting reminder of humanity's fragility before holiness. The people watched Moses ascend once more into the mountain's shadow, uncertain whether mercy would follow or wrath would fall. Their guilt hung heavy in the air like dust after battle. Aaron moved among them, his presence quiet, his heart crushed by the memory of his mistake. Leadership had taught him that power without obedience is hollow, but now he began to understand that mercy is born from brokenness. On the mountain, Moses pleaded for his people with a depth of compassion that defied comprehension. His voice rose not in anger, but in sorrow, carrying the weight of an entire nation's sin. He spoke not as a ruler defending his followers, but as a shepherd refusing to abandon his flock. "Blot me out," he cried, offering himself in their place if it would spare them destruction. That prayer became the turning point between mercy and judgment, revealing a love that reflected the very heart of God. Below, Aaron knelt in repentance, his soul searching for restoration. His role as priest had never felt heavier. He was the bridge between heaven's holiness and humanity's weakness, and now that bridge felt shattered. But divine grace has a way of rebuilding what human hands destroy. Through Moses' intercession, forgiveness began to flow once more, not because the people deserved it, but because mercy belongs to the nature of the one they had betrayed. When Moses descended carrying new tablets, they shone not only with divine law, but with renewed covenant. The people gathered in silence, their faces bowed, their voices hushed by reverence and remorse. Aaron stood among them, no longer a leader of command, but of humility. His authority now came not from position, but from repentance. Those who once followed his instruction now saw in him a living testimony of restoration, a reminder that even leaders can fall and rise again under grace. As the tabernacle was built, Aaron's role was redeemed. He would wear garments of holiness, not to glorify himself, but to symbolize the covering of divine mercy. The breastplate upon his chest carried 12 stones, each representing a tribe that had once rebelled, but now found forgiveness. Every time he entered the sanctuary, he carried those names before God as a living prayer of intercession. His silence had once allowed sin to rise. Now his voice would become a vessel for reconciliation. Moses and Aaron together embodied the dual nature of divine love, justice and mercy intertwined. Moses stood as the advocate before God, pleading for forgiveness. Aaron stood before the people, reminding them of the cost of sin and the beauty of repentance. Their partnership became the bridge between holiness and humanity, each reflecting a different aspect of divine compassion. Through them, Israel learned that true leadership is not about perfection, but about intercession, the willingness to stand in the gap between failure and forgiveness. Each act of worship in the tabernacle was a reminder of that truth. The burning incense rising upward symbolized prayers offered through Aaron's restored hands. The sacrifices upon the altar spoke of redemption through obedience. The light of the lampstand reflected a covenant renewed. The same hands that once shaped an idol now prepared offerings of worship, proving that restoration is stronger than failure when touched by divine mercy. Between mercy and judgment lies the space where faith is purified. Moses' intercession and Aaron's repentance revealed that love does not ignore sin, but transforms it into a lesson of grace. Their story became a living testament to the truth that divine justice never stands alone. It is always accompanied by compassion that refuses to abandon the fallen. Through their service, Israel learned that forgiveness is not weakness, but the highest expression of divine power. When the years of wandering drew toward their close, the wilderness that had once felt endless began to change. The air carried a new stillness, as though creation itself sensed that one chapter was nearing completion. Moses and Aaron, aged and weathered by decades of trials, walked side by side through the fading light of evening. Their faces bore the marks of faith and fatigue, their eyes filled with memories of miracles and mistakes. They had carried a nation through storms of rebellion and seas of mercy, and now the horizon stretched before them, shimmering with promise. For Aaron, the journey was drawing to its sacred conclusion. On Mount Hor, surrounded by his brother and his son Eleazar, he removed the garments of priesthood that had once symbolized divine authority. Each fold of fabric, each jewel upon the breastplate, carried the memory of intercession and sacrifice. As Moses placed those garments upon Eleazar, a quiet transfer of calling took place. Aaron's role on earth had ended, but his legacy would continue through generations of priests who would serve as mediators between God and his people. When Aaron closed his eyes for the final time, peace rested upon him like the evening sun. His life, once marked by failure, had become a testimony of redemption. The people who had once doubted his leadership now mourned him with reverence, remembering not his mistakes, but his faithfulness. Moses stood beside his brother's resting place, his heart heavy with loss, but filled with gratitude for the journey they had shared. Two voices, once joined in purpose, had now grown quiet, but their harmony continued to echo through the hearts of those they had led. As the people moved forward, Moses carried the mantle of leadership alone. Each step brought him closer to the land promised to their fathers, though he knew he would not cross its borders. His years had been spent standing between heaven and earth, pleading, guiding, correcting, and believing. Every scar upon his spirit told a story of faith refined through obedience. His eyes still shone with the same fire that had once burned in the bush, though his body had grown frail. From Mount Nebo, he gazed upon the landscape that had been the goal of his calling. Valleys and rivers stretched before him, fertile and full of life, a fulfillment of every promise spoken by God. He did not weep for what he could not have. His joy came from seeing the people he had carried finally reaching their destiny. His task had never been to enter the land, but to prepare a generation to walk into it. The view before him was not loss, but completion, the evidence of a mission fulfilled through faith. Aaron's voice may have faded, but his lineage continued through those who bore the priestly call. Moses' leadership would soon pass into memory, but his law and wisdom remained as the foundation of a nation. Together, their lives had written a story not of perfection, but of partnership, a divine symphony of faith, humility, and endurance. They had begun as two brothers, walking different roads, and through divine purpose, their paths had converged into one unbroken line of destiny. When Moses spoke his final words, his voice carried both authority and tenderness. He reminded the people that faith is not a destination, but a journey that must continue in every heart. His legacy was not merely the law written on stone, but the living example of obedience written in his life. His climb up Mount Nebo was not a farewell, but an ascent into eternal rest, where the servant finally meets the master. Their story remains a sacred testament to the beauty of divine partnership. Moses and Aaron, two voices born of the same family, answered a single call that changed the course of history. One spoke, the other acted, one interceded, the other proclaimed. Both lived to glorify the will of the one who sent them. Their earthly journey reached its conclusion upon separate mountains, but their call remains united forever, a melody of faith and obedience echoing through time, inviting every heart to rise when called and walk together in trust and unity. Centuries have passed since the voices of Moses and Aaron echoed across the deserts of Sinai, yet their call still lingers within the rhythm of human history. It moves quietly through the hearts of those who dare to listen, through lives that still wrestle between faith and fear, obedience and hesitation. Their story was not a tale confined to scrolls or monuments. It was a living prophecy that continues to unfold each time a person chooses courage over comfort and truth over silence. The bond they shared, the mission they carried, remains a reminder that divine purpose is never meant to fade. It transforms, evolves, and continues through every generation willing to answer its whisper. The courage that stood before Pharaoh now stands in those who confront injustice with compassion. The faith that walked through parted waters now lives in those who face impossibility with trust. The endurance that bore the weight of leadership now breathes in every soul that carries the burdens of others, in prayer, patience, and perseverance. What began as a mission to free a nation has become an eternal lesson in what it means to be guided by the unseen hand of purpose. Their story endures because it speaks not only of deliverance from bondage, but of transformation within the heart. Every generation faces its own Egypt, places where pride, fear, and oppression build invisible walls. Every heart encounters its own wilderness, where doubt and faith wrestle beneath the silence of waiting. And in every such moment, the legacy of Moses and Aaron speaks again, calling each person to remember that they too are part of a greater plan. Deliverance still happens when voices unite, when faith acts, when courage rises, and when trust remains unbroken even in uncertainty. Moses' strength and Aaron's voice are still alive in those who lead with humility and speak with truth. Their partnership reflects the beauty of divine collaboration, the understanding that no calling is ever meant to be carried alone. The unity they shared transcends time, teaching that purpose grows stronger when hearts move in harmony. Those who follow their example do not merely recall an ancient story, they continue it, carrying forward the flame that once burned on the mountain, lighting new paths in the darkness of doubt. Their faith teaches that every obstacle hides an opportunity for revelation. Each desert season, no matter how desolate, becomes holy ground when walked with obedience. Their endurance through struggle reveals that divine timing is never late and divine mercy never runs dry. Through their story, the eternal voice of purpose still asks every heart a question. Will you answer the call as they did, not with perfection, but with trust? The unseen legacy of these two brothers invites the world to rise above fear, to believe that freedom begins within, and to see that divine partnership is not a relic of the past, but a present reality. Every act of kindness, every prayer spoken for others, every step of faith becomes a continuation of their mission. The call that began in fire and thunder now moves quietly through compassion and faithfulness, turning ordinary lives into instruments of divine will. When the heart listens closely, it can still hear that ancient echo, the same voice that called from the burning bush, the same promise that led through the sea, the same grace that forgave failure and renewed hope. It speaks still, not in thunder or flame, but in the quiet conviction that faith and unity can change the world. The call continues, waiting for those who will answer it not with fear, but with the same devotion that carried two brothers into history and beyond. Their story closes where ours begins. The call they answered belongs to all who believe that truth endures beyond time, that mercy triumphs over judgment, and that unity gives birth to miracles. The same God who guided them still guides those who walk in faith today. Through every act of obedience, through every partnership built on trust and love, the legacy of Moses and Aaron lives on. Two voices, one call, still speaking across the ages. If this story touched your heart, let its message continue through you. Subscribe to the channel to stay connected with more spiritual journeys like this one. Click the like button to support the message, share this video with those you love so that faith may reach further, and leave a comment to reflect on what part of this story moved you most. Your voice keeps the call alive. Your faith helps the message continue.